In the vast steppes of Central Asia, where nomadic tribes roamed beneath endless skies, a dynasty would emerge that would reshape the Islamic world forever. This is the story of the Seljuk Empire, a tale of conquest, culture, and the clash between East and West that would echo through the centuries. Our story begins in the 10th century, in the windswept grasslands north of the Caspian and Aral seas. Here lived the Oghuz Turks, a confederation of nomadic tribes who had mastered the art of mounted warfare. Among these tribes was the Kinnik clan, led by a warrior named Seljuk. Seljuk ibn Dikak was more than just a tribal leader. Around 985 CE, he made a decision that would change history. He converted to Sunni Islam. This wasn't merely a personal choice. It was a strategic move that would unite his people under a common faith and give them legitimacy in the Islamic world. After Seljuk's death around 1007, his grandsons, Tughril Beg and Tughril Beg, inherited both his ambition and his vision. The Seljuk tribe, now numbering in the tens of thousands, began their migration southward into the lands of Islam. These weren't mere raiders. The Seljuks were a mobile nation, bringing with them their families, their flocks, and their destiny. They first entered the service of the Ghaznavid Empire as mercenaries, but they had grander plans. The moment that announced the arrival of the Seljuks to the world came on May 23, 1040, at a place called Dandana Khan, near Merv, in modern-day Turkmenistan. Sultan Masud of Ghazni led a massive army against the Seljuk brothers. The Ghaznavids were confident. They had defeated Hindu armies and conquered vast territories, but they had never faced an enemy quite like this. The Seljuk mounted archers struck like lightning. Using hit-and-run tactics perfected on the steppes, they peppered the Ghaznavid heavy cavalry with arrows, then wheeled away before their enemies could respond. The disciplined ranks of Masud's army crumbled under this mobile warfare. When the dust settled, the Ghaznavid Empire's power in the east was broken forever. The Seljuks had announced themselves as the new masters of Khorasan. Tughril Beg, whose name meant Falcon Prince, was now the undisputed leader of the Seljuks. But he understood that military conquest was only the beginning. To build a lasting empire, he needed legitimacy in the Islamic world. The Seljuks positioned themselves as champions of Sunni orthodoxy against the Shia Fatimid Caliphate in Egypt and the various Shia dynasties that had fragmented the once mighty Abbasid Empire. This wasn't just political opportunism. It was a genuine religious conviction that would define Seljuk rule. In 1055, Tughril made his boldest move yet. The Abbasid Caliph al-Qaim in Baghdad was virtually powerless, controlled by Shia warlords. Tughril marched on the ancient capital of the Caliphate, not as a conqueror, but as a liberator. When Tughril entered Baghdad, he prostrated himself before the Caliph, a gesture that shocked the Islamic world. Here was a Turkish warlord who could have seized power absolutely, instead showing respect for the spiritual authority of the Caliphate. "You are the Sultan of the East and West, the defender of the faithful." With these words, the Caliph granted Tughril the title of Sultan, making him the secular ruler of the Islamic world while preserving the Caliph's spiritual authority. It was a brilliant compromise that gave the Seljuks legitimacy while respecting Islamic tradition. Alp Arslan, the lion hero, reigned 1063 to 1072. When Tughril died childless in 1063, power passed to his nephew, Alp Arslan, the heroic lion. If Tughril was the founder, Alp Arslan was the conqueror who would expand Seljuk power to its zenith. Standing nearly 7 feet tall with a distinctive long moustache, Alp Arslan embodied the warrior tradition of the steppes. But he was more than a mere fighter. He was a strategic genius who understood both warfare and statecraft. The Byzantine threat. To the west lay the Byzantine Empire, heir to Rome and still a formidable power. Emperor Constantine X had died in 1067, leaving the empire in turmoil. His successor, Romanos IV Diogenes, was determined to restore Byzantine prestige through military victory. The Byzantines had been losing ground in Anatolia to Turkmen raiders for decades. Romanos IV decided that the time had come for a decisive blow against the Seljuks. He assembled the largest Byzantine army in generations, perhaps 40,000 men drawn from across the empire. The Battle of Manzikert, August 26, 1071. The two greatest military powers of their age met on a plain near the town of Manzikert, north of Lake Van in eastern Anatolia. Neither ruler intended this to be the decisive battle it became. Arslan had been campaigning against the Fatimids in Syria when news reached him of the massive Byzantine invasion. Racing north with only a portion of his forces, he initially hoped to avoid battle and negotiate. "What do you seek? If it is cities, I shall give you the strongest. If it is treasure, I shall satisfy your desires. If it is to wage war, then I am ready." Firmly. "Nothing will satisfy me save surrender or battle." The battle began with the traditional exchange of arrows. The Seljuk mounted archers, vastly outnumbered, began their time-tested tactic of feigned retreat. The Byzantine center, led by Emperor Romanos himself, pursued exactly as Alp Arslan had planned. What happened next changed the course of history. As the Byzantine center extended itself, Seljuk forces swept around the flanks. Rumors spread that the emperor had fallen. The elite Varangian Guard fought desperately, but the Byzantine army began to disintegrate. When the dust settled, the unthinkable had happened. A Roman emperor had been captured in battle for the first time in over 7 centuries. Romanos IV Diogenes knelt before Alp Arslan as a prisoner, the magnanimous victor. What followed was one of the most remarkable scenes in medieval history. Alp Arslan, the barbarian conqueror in Byzantine eyes, treated his imperial prisoner with extraordinary courtesy. "What would you do if I were brought before you as a prisoner? Perhaps I would kill you or exhibit you in the streets of Constantinople. My punishment is more severe. I forgive you and set you free."
Alp Arslan demanded a ransom of 1 million gold pieces and an annual tribute, but he treated Romanos as an honored guest. After a week, he personally escorted the emperor to the frontier and set him free. The consequences of Manzikert. The Battle of Manzikert didn't immediately conquer Anatolia for the Seljuks. That process would take decades. But it broke the spell of Byzantine invincibility and opened the gates for Turkish migration into Asia Minor. Ironically, Alp Arslan gained little personal benefit from his greatest victory. Less than a year later, he was killed in 1072 while campaigning against the Karakhanids in Central Asia, reportedly by a prisoner who stabbed him while being questioned. Malik Shah Thurin. The apex of power, R. 1072 to 1092. With Alp Arslan's death, the empire passed to his 18-year-old son, Malik Shah. Many expected the young sultan to be a puppet ruler, but they were wrong. Under Malik Shah's reign, the great Seljuk Empire reached its zenith. Malik Shah established his capital at Isfahan, transforming it into one of the world's great cities. Under his rule, the Seljuk Empire stretched from the Mediterranean to Central Asia, from the Caucasus to the Persian Gulf, rivaling the ancient Achaemenid Empire in scope. The Great Vizier, Nizam al-Mulk. Behind every great ruler stands a great administrator, and Malik Shah found his in Nizam al-Mulk, one of history's greatest statesmen. For 30 years, this Persian bureaucrat served as the power behind the Seljuk throne. Nizam al-Mulk understood that the Seljuks faced a fundamental challenge. how to transform a nomadic confederation into a stable, settled empire. His solution was the Iqta system, a form of military feudalism that granted land in exchange for military service. Nizam al-Mulk. The kingdom is like a garden. The Sultan is the gardener, the army the fence, the people the soil, and justice the water. The Nizamiya schools. But Nizam al-Mulk's greatest legacy wasn't political, it was educational. He established a network of madrasas, Islamic schools, throughout the empire. The most famous was the Nizamiya in Baghdad, which became the Harvard of the medieval Islamic world. These schools didn't just teach Islamic law and theology, they were centers of learning that preserved and transmitted Greek philosophy, Persian literature, and Islamic science. Among their graduates was al-Ghazali, one of Islam's greatest theologians and philosophers. The assassins and internal strife. But even at its height, the Seljuk Empire faced internal challenges. The most dramatic came from an unexpected source, a radical Shia sect known as the Assassins. Led by Hassan-i-Sabah, the assassins seized the mountain fortress of Alamut in 1090 and began a campaign of targeted killings against Seljuk officials. Their weapon wasn't armies but terror, carefully planned assassinations that struck fear into the hearts of their enemies. In 1092, the unthinkable happened. Assassins struck down Nizam al-Mulk while he travelled between cities. Within weeks, Sultan Malik Shah also died, possibly poisoned, possibly of natural causes. The golden age of the great Seljuks was coming to an end. Fragmentation and the Crusades, 1092 to 1194. The Great Fragmentation. With the deaths of Malik Shah and Nizam al-Mulk, the great Seljuk Empire began to fragment. The empire was divided among Malik Shah's sons, each ruling different regions and often fighting among themselves. This fragmentation had catastrophic consequences. Just as the Islamic world was dividing against itself, a new threat was emerging from the West, the Crusades. The First Crusade, 1095 to 1099. In 1095, Pope Urban II called for a holy war to reclaim Jerusalem from the Muslims. The timing couldn't have been worse for the Islamic world. The once mighty Seljuk Empire was now divided into competing kingdoms. The First Crusade faced not a united Seljuk Empire, but a patchwork of rival sultanates. In Anatolia, the Sultanate of Rum struggled to control Turkish nomads. In Syria, local Seljuk princes fought among themselves while also battling the Fatimids of Egypt. The Siege of Nicaea, 1097. The first major test came at Nicaea, capital of the Sultanate of Rum. Sultan Kilyaj Arslan had initially dismissed the Crusaders as just another group of Byzantine mercenaries. He was campaigning in the east when the Crusader army arrived at his capital. The siege revealed both Seljuk strengths and weaknesses. The walls of Nicaea were strong, and the garrison fought bravely. But without unity among the Seljuk princes, the city was doomed. After a month-long siege, Nicaea fell, not to assault, but to Byzantine treachery. The Battle of Dorylaeum, July 1st, 1097. Kilyaj Arslan was determined to stop the Crusaders before they could reach Syria. At Dorylaeum, he assembled a large Turkish army and launched a surprise attack on the Crusader vanguard. The battle began at dawn with the traditional Turkish arrow storm. The Crusader knights, caught while making camp, formed a defensive circle. For hours, Turkish mounted archers circled them like wolves, raining down arrows. But the Crusaders had learned from Manzikert. They refused to break formation, absorbing the Turkish attacks while waiting for reinforcements. When the Crusader main body arrived, they launched a devastating cavalry charge that scattered the Turkish forces. Dorylaeum was a disaster for the Seljuks. It demonstrated that their traditional tactics were less effective against the heavily armoured Crusader knights, and it opened the road to Syria. The fall of Jerusalem, 1099. The ultimate tragedy came in 1099 when the Crusaders captured Jerusalem. The city fell not to the great Seljuk Sultan, who was fighting his own relatives, but to a relatively small Crusader army that had been reinforced along the way. The massacre that followed shocked both Christian and Muslim worlds. The Crusaders killed thousands of Muslims, Jews, and even Eastern Christians. For the Islamic world, it was a wake-up call that would eventually lead to the rise of leaders like Nur ad-Din and Saladin. The Sultanate of Rum, 1077 to 1308. While the great Seljuk Empire fragmented, one branch of the family created something more lasting, the Sultanate of Rum in Anatolia. Founded by Suleiman ibn Kutalmish in 1077, it would outlast all other Seljuk states. The Sultanate of Rum faced unique challenges. Unlike other Seljuk states, it was carved out of Byzantine territory and populated largely by Christians. The Seljuk sultans had to balance Turkish nomadic traditions with the need to govern settled populations. Cultural synthesis in Anatolia. What emerged was remarkable. A unique synthesis of Turkish, Persian, Byzantine, and Arab cultures. The Seljuks of Rum became great patrons of architecture, commissioning magnificent mosques and madrasas that blended Islamic and Byzantine styles. Cities like Konya became centers of Islamic learning and mysticism. It was here that the great Sufi poet Rumi would later find refuge, creating some of Persian literature's greatest masterpieces. Revival and Decline, 1118 to 1194. Sultan Sanjar, the last great sultan, Armenia, 1118-1157. In the early 12th century, one man attempted to restore the glory of the great Seljuks, Sultan Sanjar, the last son of Malik Shah, to rule. From his capital at Merv, he tried to reunite the fractured empire. Sanjar was a throwback to the great sultans of old, a warrior poet who combined military prowess with patronage of the arts. Under his rule, the eastern provinces of the empire enjoyed a cultural renaissance. The Ghurid challenge. But Sanjar faced new challenges from the east. The Ghurids, a dynasty from the mountains of Afghanistan, were expanding their power. Unlike previous enemies, they couldn't be defeated by traditional Turkish cavalry tactics. The Ghurids fought in the mountains, where Turkish mobility was useless. They built fortress after fortress, creating a network of strongholds that could withstand siege. Slowly but surely, they began to push into Seljuk territory. The Oghuz Rebellion, 1153. The crisis that broke Sanjar's power came from an unexpected source, his own people. In 1153, the Oghuz tribes that had always been the backbone of Seljuk power rose in rebellion. The grievances were complex. The settled administration that Nizam al-Mulk had created worked well for governing cities, but it often ignored the needs of the nomadic tribes. Taxation, settlement policies, and cultural changes had alienated the very people who had created the empire. Narrator. The rebellion succeeded beyond anyone's expectations. Sanjar himself was captured and held prisoner for 3 years. When he finally escaped in 1156, his empire was in ruins. The Khwarezm Challenge. As the great Seljuks declined, new powers rose to fill the vacuum. The most successful were the Khwarezm Shahs, originally governors under the Seljuks, who gradually became independent rulers. The Anushtaghinide dynasty of Khwarezm cleverly positioned themselves as the true heirs of the Seljuks. They adopted Seljuk titles, claimed descent from the Turkish nobility, and gradually absorbed former Seljuk territories. The end of an era, 1157 to 1194. The death of the great Seljuk Sultan Sanjar died in 1157, and with him died the great Seljuk Empire. His death marked the end of nearly 120 years of Seljuk dominance in the Islamic world. What followed was a period of chaos and fragmentation. Local dynasties carved up the former Seljuk territories. The Khwarezm Shahs controlled Iran and Central Asia. The Ayyubids under Saladin rose in Syria and Egypt. The Sultanate of Rum continued in Anatolia. The great unity of the Islamic world under Turkish leadership was broken. The rise of Saladin and the counter-crusade. Ironically, it was the fragmentation of Seljuk power that eventually led to the Islamic reconquest of Jerusalem. Saladin, the Kurdish general who founded the Ayyubid dynasty, succeeded where the divided Seljuks had failed. At the Battle of Hattin in 1187, Saladin destroyed the Crusader army and recaptured Jerusalem. But Saladin's success came not from continuing Seljuk policies, but from abandoning them. He reunited Egypt and Syria under a single ruler, something the fragmented Seljuk princes had been unable to achieve. The last sultan, Tughril III, Ayturs R. 1176 to 1194. The final act of the great Seljuk drama played out in the last years of the 12th century. Tughril III, great-nephew of Sultan Sanjar, attempted one final restoration of Seljuk power. But it was too late. The Khwarezm Shahs, now led by Arslan and his son Turkish, were too powerful. In a series of battles between 1192 and 1194, they systematically destroyed the remaining Seljuk forces. Tughril III died in battle in 1194, the last sultan of the great Seljuks. With his death, nearly 160 years of Seljuk rule came to an end. Legacy and conclusion. The Seljuk achievement. The Seljuk Empire lasted less than 2 centuries, but its impact on world history was profound. The Seljuks transformed the Islamic world from an Arab-dominated civilization into a truly cosmopolitan one that included Turks, Persians, Arabs, and others as equals. Their patronage of Islamic learning created institutions that outlasted the empire itself. The madrasa system they perfected spread throughout the Islamic world and influenced education for centuries. Architectural legacy Seljuk architecture created a new synthesis that would influence Islamic building for centuries. Their distinctive blend of Turkish, Persian, and Arab styles can be seen in monuments from Isfahan to Konya, from Baghdad to Damascus. The 4 Iwan mosque plan, the Mokarnas vault, the elaborate geometric tilework, all innovations that we associate with Islamic architecture were perfected under Seljuk patronage. The Turkish transformation of Islam. Perhaps most importantly, the Seljuks completed the transformation of Islam from an Arab tribal religion into a world civilization. They proved that non-Arabs could not only convert to Islam, but could lead the Islamic world. This transformation had profound consequences. It opened Islam to the steppes of Central Asia and eventually to the Indian subcontinent. The later Ottoman Empire, which would become Islam's greatest power, traced its legitimacy back through the Seljuks to the Turkish tribal traditions of Central Asia. The crusading impact. The Seljuk period also saw the first sustained contact between the Islamic world and medieval Europe through the Crusades. This contact, however violent, led to an exchange of ideas, technologies, and cultural practices that enriched both civilizations. European knowledge of Islamic philosophy, science, and medicine increased dramatically during this period. At the same time, the Islamic world gained new military technologies and architectural techniques from the West. The end of unity. But perhaps the Seljuks' greatest failure was their inability to create a lasting system of succession. The constant civil wars between Seljuk princes weakened the empire and made it vulnerable to both internal rebellion and external attack. This failure had tragic consequences. When the Mongols invaded the Islamic world in the 13th century, they found not the united Seljuk Empire, but a patchwork of competing dynasties. The destruction that followed might have been avoided if Seljuk unity had been maintained. The continuing legacy. The Seljuk legacy lived on in their successor states. The Sultanate of Rum continued until 1308, when it was finally absorbed by the rising Ottoman Empire. The Ottomans consciously modelled themselves on the Seljuks, adopting their titles, their governmental systems, and their claim to leadership of the Sunni Islamic world. In Iran, the memory of great Seljuk rule remained strong. Later Persian dynasties, from the Safavids to the Qajars, looked back to the Seljuk period as a golden age when Iran was the centre of a great Islamic empire. The modern echo, even today, the Seljuk legacy continues. The modern Republic of Turkey sees itself as the heir to both the Seljuks and the Ottomans. Turkish nationalism draws heavily on the memory of the great Seljuk sultans who first brought Turkish power to the Middle East. In Central Asia, the newly independent republics of Kazakhstan, Kyrgyzstan, Turkmenistan, and Uzbekistan also claim the Seljuk legacy. For them, the Seljuks represent the last time that Central Asian peoples ruled a great empire. The story of the Seljuk Empire is ultimately the story of transformation. The transformation of nomadic tribes into imperial rulers, of Arab Islam into world civilization, of the medieval Middle East from Byzantine and Arab dominance to Turkish leadership. In the ruins of their palaces and mosques, in the pages of the books they preserved and the institutions they created, the Seljuks left an indelible mark on world history. They proved that empires are built not just by conquest, but by the vision to create something greater than the sum of their parts. From the steppes of Central Asia to the gates of Constantinople, from the libraries of Baghdad to the battlefields of Anatolia, the Seljuks changed the world. Their empire may have lasted less than 2 centuries, but their legacy endures still. In the architecture of Isfahan, in the poetry of Rumi, in the very shape of the Islamic world they helped to create. This has been the story of the Seljuk Empire, nomads who became emperors, warriors who became patrons of learning, Turks who became guardians of Islamic civilization. In their rise and fall, we see reflected the eternal human drama of ambition and achievement, of glory and decline, of the dreams that build empires and the realities that destroy them.